We're going to move into the 170 wiring installation. So in this video, we'll go through connecting to your main van battery electrical or your auxiliary post, and then we'll go through running our full electrical wiring through the van itself. You can see here there's a steel plate at the back of the van on your driver's side. This is going to be kind of our finished product for this step. This is where all of your leads will feed into your 12-volt fuse block. In your electrical kit, you're going to have a small box that's going to be your first step in your install process. This is going to contain a few components. One is going to be a black negative ground connection wire. One is going to be a short red positive connection wire. And then you're also going to have a small switch with a fuse included. We'll move into later the more specifics on how these all get installed. Your second box is going to be the wires that we're actually going to run under the van. So this is what's going to pull power from that seat base all the way back to that fuse block behind the wheel well. Your third box is going to be your fuse block and all of your fuses, all the components to make the connections from your actual wiring harnesses that runs power to all your components to your fuse block. Your fourth box is going to be all of your end connections. So this is all going to be done after the wiring harness is installed and hooked up to the fuse blocks. This will be your very last step. Your main wiring looms are going to be in the actual wiring harness box. You're going to have 4. The white and the blue are going to run to your passenger side connections, and then the black and the orange are going to be your driver's side connections. So the first and most important step of our wiring harness install is to disconnect the main ground for your van. This is going to cut power to all of the electrical connections that we're going to be messing with under the seat. So this will make sure that you're operating safely and also make sure that you're not throwing any codes or creating issues with the electrical of the van. This connection is housed under the driver's seat right up next to the gas pedal. There's a little cover that you can pop off and then disconnect it using that red button on the top of the ground post. Once you have that ground disconnected, we're going to want to remove our driver's seat. There's 4 bolts, 1 in each corner. You might have to move the emergency brake if you have one, or get a different socket size depending on which connection you're undoing, just because the seat can kind of be in the way. A good tip is if your seats are on swivels, you can move the seat out of your way and make it a little easier for yourself. Once you have your bolts removed, you're going to want to disconnect the 2 wires from under your seat that connect to the main wiring harness in that seat base. This will allow you to remove the seat safely. So you can see here we've got them disconnected. They just have some little factory clips that hold them in. And then you want to set those to the side and remove this little like padded cover that's over all of the connections under the seat base. Once you have full access to the seat base, we're going to want to move this like connection bar out of our way. So there's just a screw in each side that you can undo and shift that. We usually shift it towards the back of the van, just kind of up and out of the way to give us access to the connections underneath. I like to always put my hardware back in the holes that they came from so that I know exactly where they are and I don't lose them. Otherwise, you can just keep a little cup on hand to keep all of your hardware safe and in one spot. We're going to move on to removing the little 12-volt outlet on the passenger side of the seat base. We're going to replace this with a switch. So there's a couple plastic tabs on the back side of that outlet that need to be engaged to remove it. This can be a little tricky. We're not going to be reusing this outlet, so if you do end up like causing damage to it, don't worry about it too much. Once you have it removed, we're going to open up that hole a little bit. You just need to open it up by like 1/8 of an inch or so to allow our switch to go and fit into that hole. You're going to want to use a large step bit to make this hole. Once you've test fit your switch, you can go ahead and deburr the hole and rust prevent. We want to make sure to treat that exposed metal to make sure you don't have any rust form down the line. So the first thing we're going to show is the connection, and this to an auxiliary battery. So this is only if you have a factory auxiliary battery. If you don't, you can skip past this part to the section where we're going to connect to the main starter battery. But if you have an auxiliary battery, you're going to have a little housing for a bus bar underneath your driver's seat base, which we show here. So you can pop that out of place, and then there should just be some plastic retaining clips for the cover on that. And you can pop that off. And then you can see here there's a connection on the far right side. And there's usually a factory fuse already, but there will also be an 80 amp fuse in your electrical kit that you can use. So you're going to connect that to that far right post, and then using the cable that comes in your battery connection box, there's a 4-gauge cable labeled battery terminal on one end and then seat base switch on the other. So you're going to connect the battery terminal end to the other end of that 80 amp fuse and then tighten down your nut. After you've done that, you can reconnect the cover to that bus bar and then position it back into place in the seat base where you found it. After that connection's complete, you're going to take the other end and route it to kind of the forward right-hand side of your driver's seat base, and we'll connect that to the switch a little later on. If you don't have a factory auxiliary battery, where you've provided all the parts to connect to your main starter battery for the van, note that this is not approved by Mercedes, but it is the only way to hook up to your main van power to power the rest of your kit. So to do this, we're going to go underneath your driver's seat footwell and remove that rubber cover first to gain access to the battery. Once you've done that, you're going to want to remove 4 bolts for the cover plate and make sure to put those in a safe place. I like to put them back into the holes that they came from so that I don't lose track of them. But once you've done that, the battery will be exposed, and there's a little housing on the positive side of the battery. You can see here we kind of pop it out of place. This is going to be another protection from Mercedes. So this has a cutoff from the factory so that you don't drain your battery all the way down connecting anything to it. You still want to be really cognizant of not using too much power because it will drain it pretty low, but it will cut off power to your kit before your main battery is totally dead. So once you've located that kind of housing, you can disconnect it from the main battery and pull it out. You're going to use that same cable that you would have used if you had an auxiliary battery and that 80 amp fuse as well. We've put it onto a bench here so it's a little bit easier to see. Once you've removed the plastic housing from the main battery, we're going to install a shunt, which is basically going to allow us to transfer power off of that main bus bar to another post. The shunt is going to come in your battery connection kit from Adventure Wagon, and so there'll be 2 holes in that. So the sizing of the hole will determine which orientation it goes, and it's going to be right next to a 125 amp MIDI fuse from Mercedes. So once you have your shunt in place, you want to tighten down the nut on the main bus bar and then connect the 80 amp fuse to the other side, which is going to connect power from the shunt to our cable. After you have the 80 amp fuse in place, you want to connect the battery terminal side of your 4-gauge cable from your electrical kit to the other side of that 80 amp fuse. And there will be a little spot in the plastic housing that kind of routes where that wire will be. So that's a good kind of tell that you've got everything in the right spot. After you have everything connected, you want to tighten down all of your nuts and make sure those are nice and secure. And then we can reinstall this housing back onto the positive terminal of your battery. After you have the battery all reconnected, you can put back on the cover plate, and then you want to route your cable underneath your driver's seat base. There's a plastic housing on the right side of your seat base that can be removed if you're having trouble getting the cable inside. You need the other end of that connection cable to end up in the forward right-hand corner of your seat base. There's a factory outlet there that we're going to replace with a switch to connect to the rest of the kit. Now we're going to move on to installing our switch and making those connections. Which post you're connecting to here doesn't matter. This is just an on-off switch for our positive connections. You don't have to tighten this down all the way yet either. Having it a little bit loose and allowing yourself some wiggle room in terms of the wire placement is kind of nice once you've got it installed. And then we can tighten it up all the way once everything's in there and connected. Put that wire through the hole that we made in the side of the seat base and thread that collar over the wire and then reinstall it to the back of the switch. This is gonna secure it to the side of the seat base and keep it from going anywhere. We found that having the wire come towards the back of the van off that switch is the easiest. We're gonna have both connections actually run in the same direction. After we've connected our main battery cable to our switch, we're going to move to the back of the van so that we can feed our positive cable from our fuse block location forward. In order to do this, we're going to need to drill a 1 3/8 inch hole through the bottom of the van. So you can see here we're kind of showing that placement. There's a little corrugation in the sheet metal inside the actual van wall. Your hole is going to be just after that. There isn't a super precise location. We basically just want our wires to come out near this plastic cover underneath the van, which we'll show shortly. So once you've kind of located this position, you can go ahead and drill your hole. Just make sure it's centered forward to back inside that van cavity. And after you've drilled the hole, go ahead and deburr, rust prevent, all your normal steps for when we're drilling holes in the metal. As your rust prevent is drying, you can go ahead and feed your positive and negative cables back to our fuse block location. So they're going to start near that hole you just drilled, and then it can feed up over the wheel well. It's best here to feed inside the kind of corrugation of the van instead of tucked right on top of the wheel well. We're going to use some zip ties later on to secure these cables as well to make sure they don't get pinched in between the pieces of metal and cause you like shorting out issues down the line. But go ahead and just feed those back. Keep it pretty loose for right now so you have a little bit of slack to move things around as needed when we're running cables like forward and back. You a lot of times have to shift where things are positioned as you go through the process. The bulk of the positive and the negative leads are going to run under the van. So after you've got one end kind of in that bay where the fuse block is going to live, all of the rest is going to feed through the hole that you drilled down underneath the van. Before you feed the cables through the hole to underneath, you want to feed on a little plastic grommet that's included in your electrical kit. This is going to protect the cables from getting cut or snagged on the sheet metal of the hole that you drilled. After you've passed your cables underneath, you can pop underneath the van, and there's going to be this large plastic cover kind of tucked underneath the sidewall, right underneath where you drill your hole, so kind of forward of that driver's side wheel well. Or driver's side rear wheel well. It's just a black cover. It can pop right out. It's just press fit into place. So we're going to pop that out and actually drill 2 small holes in it that are going to catch the corrugated like sheath that we're going to use to protect the cables that are running underneath the van. You can use your plastic corrugated cover to kind of make sure your hole is the right size. You want these holes big enough that can pass through, but not so big that it's going to fall out. So we use a step bit here. It ends up being like about a 1/2 inch hole, but again, I would just go little by little and test fit as you go until you've got a nice tight fit for that plastic corrugation. The corrugation does have a split down the middle, so you can feed it on after you have your cables run. It is a little bit easier to feed the cable through the corrugation instead of through the split. So I would go ahead and feed it through and just leave some slack on the end before cutting it to length. And then you can feed your positive and negative cable through that plastic cover that you pre-drilled the holes in, and then pop the cover back into place in that factory hole. After you have the plastic cover reinstalled, the other end of your positive lead is going to run all the way forward in the van to your driver's seat base. There's a rubber gasket underneath your driver's seat that has a little zip tie on it. You can cut that zip tie to feed the positive cable up into the seat base. This cable is going to connect to the other end of our switch that we installed earlier on. So it's the same switch that our positive battery connection is connected to the other post on. After you have your positive lead connected to your switch and your plastic sheathing run all the way along your positive cable, you can go ahead and reinstall that zip tie on the rubber boot. It's important to make sure this is as sealed up as possible because it keeps any moisture or debris from getting into your driver's seat base as you drive down the road. After your positive cable is connected, we're going to move on to the negative. So this is our ground. So your van's going to have a factory ground underneath, kind of towards the middle of the van. It's often tucked underneath your gas tank. So there should be a few other factory components already grounded on this post. So you can see some other wires coming into it. It's a little hard to show in video, but it's kind of, just tucked kind of in the center of the van. You want to take off the factory nut that's holding the current grounds on there, add our negative lead onto that same post, and then reinstall your nut and tighten it down. After you have your negative cable connected to the factory ground, you can add the corrugated sheathing onto your negative cable as well and cut it to length. And then after both your positive and negative are connected, we're going to go ahead and zip tie your both these leads onto the sheet metal of the van just to keep it safe and out of the way from catching on anything or interfering with any of the main van components that live underneath. We're going to move on to routing all the individual leads for the different components in the kit. So you're going to have 4 main harnesses and then 1 smaller additional harness for our lights, which we'll show later on. But we're going to start with the blue harness. This is going to be a couple of our passenger side leads. We're going to have an outlet and a USB on this lead. We're going to start all of our wiring in that rear driver's side section where our fuse block is going to live. So oftentimes it's easier to drop the main part of the harness down from above the wire chase A-frame piece and through the van down into that lower bay. It can be tricky to pass it the other way, like going up, just because of all the different breaks in the harness. So you can see here we kind of do this in chunks. We go through one part of the bay and then the next. Again, this is just easier to make sure that the harness doesn't get snagged anywhere inside the wall. There's a lot of like pinch welds and stuff like that that are easy to get the wiring stuck on. So just go slow here, and occasionally it will pop out in sections where you don't intend it to. So it might take a couple tries, especially in this very rear section. It's easy to get the cable into the D pillar instead of that actual like driver's side bay. After you've passed it down, you just want to make sure you have enough slack to get to that second to the last largest opening in the corrugations of the van. And then we can move on to the individual leads. So we're going to pass the blue lead over top of our ceiling bracers. It's really important here to make sure that you're going over top the track and the A-frame. But your first lead is going to drop down similarly to how we did on the driver's side, up and over the wire chase and down into that lower bay. This is going to be your USB 5 lead. There should be a label at the end of that lead just to show you exactly which cable is going to drop all the way down. After you've dropped that one all the way down to the lower bay on that passenger side, the next lead that we're going to run is on that same blue harness, but it's going to be labeled aux2. This is an optional lead. There's not actually a use for it in our kit, so it's just an additional 10 gauge wire that you can use for whatever you need to, but we basically just tuck it in the top wall section kind of behind the panels. So you can see here we're running it along our wire chase, and then we'll drop it behind into that wall bay and just coil it up, and then we usually attach it with a little bit of hush mat or something to keep it from rattling inside the wall. The next loom we're going to do is our white loom. So this is going to be more passenger side components. So the main part of the harness you're going to drop down through the wall just like we did with our blue harness. It's going to follow the same route and end up in that lower wall bay where our fuse block is going to be mounted later on. After you've dropped that main part of the harness, we're going to pass it over the ceiling just like we did the blue harness again. The only difference here is there's a fan lead on this harness, so that's going to pop out in the kind of center of your ceiling bay in between your two ceiling bracers. You can kind of just coil it up and tuck it under your ceiling bracer for now until you're ready to connect it to your fan. The rest of the leads are going to pass over to the other side. You have a USB 4 lead, which is going to drop down to your lower bay just behind your slider door. This is going to be for that set of outlets there. And then your other lead is your aux1. So this is going to run all the way forward on the passenger side along your wire chase and down your B pillar into your passenger side seat base. This lead is intended for a heater. So if you do not have an S-bar heater, you likely won't use this lead, and again can just leave it coiled either in the wall or in your passenger seat base for use later on. Notice that your aux1 lead only has a positive cable in it, whereas the rest have a positive and a negative, or a red and black cable. Your ground or your black cable for your heater is actually included in your main wiring harness kit. It's a small black auxiliary lead because we ground it to the main battery ground underneath the driver's seat instead of to the fuse block. For that auxiliary 1 lead that's passing all the way forward, we kind of pass it up and over the forward ceiling rib just to keep it out of the way. You can use zip ties and things here too if it's sagging or causing you any problems. We're going to move on to our driver side harnesses. So we're going to start with the orange loomed harness, and this is going to be for our forward outlets. So in order to pass this down through the van, we're going to start on the aft side of your C pillar. So we're going to pass that through the wall behind your A-frame and sheet metal, and kind of like we did in the back of the van for the blue and the white, just aft of your C pillar instead. So you're going to pass enough slack all the way down to your lower bay so that you can not only can pass it down to that lower bay, but also back to that fuse block location where your white and blue harnesses terminate. After you've passed that section of the harness back, we're going to go back to our C pillar, and in the top section of the harness, we're going to pass up and over the wire chase and back down. There's not a pass-through through that C pillar, so we have to pass it up and over. Once you have it passed up and over, we're going to pass it back down through the wall. You can drop both leads down in the same spot, so both just down on the forward edge of that C pillar and into the lower bay. So your USB 2 is going to stay kind of just forward of that C pillar, and then your USB 1 is going to pass forward to just behind your B pillar. Our last harness is going to be our black loomed harness. So this is going to be, again, driver side components. We're going to start with the same process as the orange harness by passing the main part with all of the lead terminations back down aft of that C pillar into our lower bay and back to our fuse block location. There's going to be one lead that's going to pass down that same route as the main part of the harness, which is going to be our USB 3. This should terminate in your lower bay just forward of the D-pillar. The other leads branching off from this harness are going to be our lights and our fan. So the light 2 you want to pass on the aft side of your C-pillar in the ceiling. You want to make sure that it's on you're going to have a piece of track and A-frame on that middle section. You want to make sure it's aft of that track and A-frame piece so it can connect to your aft light harness. Your light 1 lead is going to just pass on the forward side of that same A-frame and track piece in your ceiling. Just leave all this loose for now. You can kind of get a better idea later on how everything's going to connect and fit together, and having some slack to move things around can be really helpful. While we're at this part of the light harness, you will also have a little smaller harness in your electrical kit called ELPH 170-CON. This is going to allow us to connect our second and third ceiling panel light harnesses to our main cabin wire harness. So basically you'll have 3 branches on this smaller harness, one with a set of butt connectors connected, one with a Deutsch connector connected, and one with just the loose leads. So the loose leads we're going to pass up and over our ceiling ribs into the back bay of the van. So this will be aft of your second cross piece of A-frame and track. So you want to make sure that passes up and over, or the end with the Deutsch connector is going to live in your center section, so between your 2 pieces of track. And then the one with the butt connectors is going to connect into your main harness. So that light 2 lead from the main black wiring harness that we were running earlier. The lead that we passed all the way to the back of the van, so for your aft panel, or like your aft panel lights, we're going to connect a Deutsch connector on later on. You'll have a little baggie with 2 Deutsch connectors loose in it that you'll connect to that harness that you can plug in easily to the light harness in your aft panel. When your light 2 is connected to your ELPH 170-CON, you can go ahead and run your light 1 lead into the forward section of your ceiling bay. This again just has to be forward of that piece of track in A-frame in your kit. Your last lead is going to be your fan 1 on this black harness. This is going to pass into the same section that your light 1 will be. Again, just leave it loose and accessible so you can connect it to your fan when you're ready. When your wiring harnesses are run, we're going to move on to showing how we make some of our end connections. So you're going to have 5 different locations where we dropped those USB leads. So you want to make sure they're in the correct location to correspond with the outlet holes in your panels. But once they're where you want them, we're going to go ahead and strip the end of the black and the red wire. And then you'll have 5 sets of what we call like pigtails or splitters, but they're 5 sets of 2 red and 2 black wires all coming into one butt connector. So you're going to connect red to red and black to black here. This is going to give you both positive and negative connections for your 2 sets of outlets at every location. After you strip the wire from your main harness, you can go ahead and crimp on the pigtail and then heat shrink it to secure it. The next connections we're going to show are your light connections. So you'll have 2 sets of Deutsch connectors in your kit that we're going to connect to the light leads that we passed into our ceiling bays from our main wiring harness. So this is really important that your wires are in the bay that you want them in before you connect the Deutsch connector, because they are pretty big, so you're not going to be able to pass those under ribs or A-frame or anything once it's connected. So definitely make sure you're in the right spot before adding these. But same process, red to red, black to black. You're going to crimp or strip your wires, crimp your butt connector on, and then heat shrink it to secure it. In the 170, you will have a extension harness for your wiring or your lights that we showed a little bit earlier in the video. So just make sure you're taking special care again to make sure that your ends are in the correct ceiling bay before adding those Deutsch connectors. We're going to move on to our main fuse block connections. So in your wiring kit, you're going to have a fuse block connection box, basically that's going to have all of your terminals. So you're going to have a mix of blue and yellow like spade terminal connectors that we're going to use to connect to all of the ends of our wiring leads that will connect into our fuse block. The blue are for 14 to 16 gauge wire, and then yellow is 12 to 10 gauge. So make sure that you're paying attention to the labels on your wires and then using the correct terminal connector for that wire gauge. This is the same process as our other connections that we made for our lights and our outlets. So you want to strip the end of your wire, crimp it securely, and give it a little tug to make sure that it's on there good, and then heat shrink to seal it up and make sure the connection is really solid. You're going to go through and do this for all of your end connections. I like to do mine all at once just so it's done, and then we can connect everything into the fuse block at one time. We're going to show an example on the bench of connecting each lead to our main fuse block. We're just going to show one connection here, and then we'll move into the van to kind of show it in real time. But you'll repeat this same process for every connection. You're going to have 12 positive connections on the lower edge of the fuse block. These are going to correspond with little spots where we'll put in our fuses later on. So it's important to make sure you're paying attention to where you're putting everything and noting down your positions as you connect these so we can put our fuses in the correct spot. And 2, you're going to make sure that you loosen the screw in the fuse block, not all the way, but enough so that you can slip that terminal connector underneath the screw head and the lock washer, and then you'll tighten it back down. All this will just be used with a hand tool, so a screwdriver, but you do want to give it a little tug when you've got the screw tightened to make sure that terminal connector can't slip out of place. I like to make sure that my negative connections, so your grounds, are all in the same order as my positive connections as well, just so it's easy reference later on if you ever have to replace any wiring or dig into an issue. You do this process inside the van, so you can see a little bit better here our installer going through and making all of his fuse block connections. While you want to record what location each lead is on the fuse block, you also want to keep all of your leads from one harness on one side of the fuse block to make sure that your wiring's not getting all tangled and bunched up behind your fuse block plate when we go to mount it. After you've made all of your lead connections to your fuse block, we're going to move on to our actual fuse plate, we call it. So it's what's going to mount your fuse block and all of your electrical connections to the van body itself. In your electrical kit, you're going to have a positive and a negative post with they'll have some nuts pre-threaded onto the bolts on the post. You're going to use those to connect it to the plate. Your leads should be long enough to have either post in either position, but just to be consistent, I would keep your negative or your black post on the top edge of the plate and then your red one underneath it. It's also really important throughout this process that all of your connections and bolts are tightened down really securely. So we'll go back through at the very end and tighten them all up, but as you go, I would make sure that you're securing everything well. It's also important here, orientation on the plate, and if you're mounting to the back or the front is really important to make sure that you're not going to interfere with the mounting of your panel later on. So just pay close attention to how our installer is doing it in the video. You can kind of see here that everything's mounting to the back side of that metal plate to make sure that the front edge is flush and the panel can be mounted over top. After you have your fuse block connected to the plate and then your positive and negative post also secured, we're going to move on to our first main connection wire from our fuse block. So you're going to have a wire that goes from the positive post on the bottom of your fuse block to that positive post that we mounted on the plate. You'll also have a negative connection cable that will do the same thing, but it'll go from the negative post on the top of the fuse block to the negative post that we mounted on the plate itself. So we're going to add another connection to both the positive and the negative posts from Adventure Wagon. So you'll have your main positive cable that we ran underneath the van and back up through that hole that we cut in the van body itself. So you'll want to run that through, and then we'll feed on our rubber boot that's included in your electrical kit over that main positive cable and the positive cable that we ran from the fuse block. So you'll thread that over and then secure both of those lugs to that positive post and tighten your bolt down. After you have everything nice and tight, you can feed that rubber grommet over top of those connections. This just protects that positive connection and makes sure that you don't have any metal to metal contact for those live wires. You'll repeat this process for the negative connections, but you'll be using your ground cable and that negative connection from your fuse block. When you have all of your connections made, we're going to go ahead and zip tie the leads that go into the fuse block. This again is just going to help any of those wires from getting tangled or caught up behind the panel and just help keep things organized. It'll help fitment be easier, and again will help if you ever have to dig into things later on. Before we move on to mounting the actual plate, just to reiterate, you want to make sure that all of your connections are nice and tight. So take the time to go back through and make sure that you've tightened everything down, nothing can pull loose, and that everything is nice and secure. After you've checked all your connections, we can mount the plate into the van body. So the plate kind of lives just in the middle of this rectangular bay aft of your driver's side wheel well. You line up the top of the plate with the corrugation that kind of sticks out into that bay. So you can see here our top edge is just on the same level as those corrugations that connect the inner metal to the like outside sheet metal of the van. These are just self-tapping screws. You'll have one in every corner. Again, it's important here that you are lining up with that corrugation because you'll have a hole pre-cut in your panel that will line up with the fuse block so you can access it without removing your wall panel. Now that your fuse block plate is mounted, you're finished with your electrical install. At this point, you can reconnect your ground and test your wiring, or you can wait until you have your panels and outlets installed and test it then. But you will want to do a full test before you have all of your panels installed in case you have to go back and check any wiring for issues.